Okay? That's not the word that I was thinking of, but it almost makes the question awkward, or awkward sounding. Not, yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Does your teacher not pay the tax? And it also spins a little bit and adds almost a hostility to it. It is almost like they were suggesting that he doesn't. Not so much a genuine inquiry, but implying that he doesn't. Does your teacher not pay the tax? Seems to me that indicates that they were assuming that he hadn't and that he didn't. It was also probably no coincidence that they showed up around this time for this reason. It was natural that they would show up at this time to get the money, because they would have known, obviously, for however they knew, they did, that Jesus had not been there to pay it. But while it's natural that they would come there, we can't help but think that they had some motivation in trying to get Jesus again. They're trying to cast him in a negative light, to trap him, involve him in some breach of the law of a very well-known obligation. Or else maybe they were just curious in a hostile way, wanting to know, hey, does he pay the tax or not? Does he not pay the tax? Peter, on the other hand, was very quick to answer in the affirmative, yes, I think, the unspoken part. Yeah.
About teacher. They didn't ask, why didn't you pay your tax?
Yeah.
It was strictly an accusation against the teacher.
Yeah, Peter was, a small fish, so to speak. They weren't concerned with him. They didn't need to pin Peter down, as a breaker of the law or whatever. They were just concerned about Jesus, his teacher. So, yeah, the fact that Jesus said, give it to them for me and for yourself, would imply that he hadn't paid this tax either. And yet they didn't even ask. They weren't even concerned about that. I think that also shows their hostility and their ulterior motive here. They weren't there just to get the 2 drachma from him. They were there hoping to, get him in trouble as well. Create some drama. Jesus had shown himself already to have some, from their perspective, strange and different views of the Jewish observances. Why don't your disciples wash their hands? Why don't your disciples fast? Why don't you fast and your disciples fast like we do and like the Pharisees do? And other things like that. Jesus showed he didn't have much respect for those things. He didn't observe them. He wasn't concerned with them. They were not in the law. They were simply the traditions of men. So in this case, even though it was part of the law, they wanted to know maybe, what's he think about this? Has he not paid it because he was away out of town for a few months or a long period of time? Or was it from some weird principle of his that, like the other things, that he didn't pay? They wanted to find out. And as we pointed out, their question implies their doubt, for sure. So I thought it was a good observation that Peter was probably concerned, as they all had been, for the things that Jesus had just told them. We can't let that slip our minds. Verse 24, and this account comes right after Jesus. He records Jesus telling them, again, I'm going to be delivered up, killed, and raised on the 3rd day. Then we know that there was near danger, it seems, often. Jesus continuously insisting at this point on this future that they didn't even want to think about. His desire not to offend, as we'll see in just a minute. and not to provoke those at whose hands he was going to be killed, like he said. These things were probably on Peter's mind, and that may be one reason why he answered so quickly and affirmatively, yes, but without even consulting with Jesus. He could have said, hang on just one second. Lord, the temple tax, yada, yada, and they would have settled it. He could have paid it. But he just said, yes, he does. And then he's going to go inside. Do you think Peter may have been trying to be a little bit secretive here? Just a thought. Do you think he was going inside to get the money to pay? Or do you think he was going inside to tell Jesus what was going on? There's no right or wrong answer, but I almost get the impression that Peter wasn't going to say anything to Jesus. But maybe he was. At any rate, Jesus revealed that he already knew everything that was going on. He knew what they had just talked about. He knew it all. He knew everything that was happening. And the text says that when he went inside, Jesus, the ESV says, and I think most English versions are similar, Jesus spoke to him first. But it has been suggested that word, that Greek word, this is the only time it's in the New Testament, but it's in the Greek version of the Old Testament 15 times, and every single time it's translated to anticipate something. It never means to speak first, but anticipate. And Alfred Edersheim said it's the Greek equivalent of a Hebrew word that means to anticipate. So it's almost like this word may suggest not just that Jesus spoke first, but that he arrived at the situation before Peter even told him. He already arrived at the solution before Peter even told him. And so Jesus had anticipated all of this. And so he speaks. Peter doesn't even have to bring it up, whether he was going to or not. And he does so in a very typical way. He just hits him with a riddle. And it's another easy one, because it was supposed to be easy. What do you think, Simon? Do kings of the earth take toll from their sons or from others? That's a no-brainer. It will be ludicrous for the king to get toll from his son, wouldn't it? Because his son, whose money does the son of the king have? The king's money. So he doesn't take tax from himself. So it's like, here's the tax, I'll take it right here, and I'll just put it right here in this pocket. I'll take it from one pocket into the other one. It doesn't even make sense. So Peter knew the answer. He said, they get it from others. So then Jesus says, well, then the sons are free, right? That's the implication. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Has Jesus lost his mind? What does this have to do with anything? You tell me, what's his point?
Jesus is the Son of the King.
Okay. Jesus, the sons are exempt from, the son of a king is exempt from the king's taxes and tolls. And in the same way, Jesus is exempt from the temple tax, because the temple is whose house? The house of Jehovah, the house of God, and Jesus is God, we know. It's his father, I guess in this sense, it would be his father's house. He's not obligated to pay. Now, it does seem like only natural that, and maybe implied in Peter's answer, that Jesus had in the past, in previous times, did pay the temple tax. But things had changed a little bit, at least a little bit, if not a lot, by this time. He had now declared in less clear terms as well as pretty straightforward terms that he is the Son of God at this point in his ministry. If he just paid the temple tax with no explanation, that might cause some confusion or apprehension, misunderstanding. But at the same time, if he didn't pay it, that would also, if he didn't pay it without explanation, that would also create some maybe difficulty, as he suggests. And so he's telling Peter, notice he's not saying this to the collectors. He's just saying it to Peter. He's telling Peter, I'm not obligated to pay this temple tribute. Now, what difference does that make? Because it's been said that around the Passover time every year is when this temple tax was usually paid. How many more of those is Jesus going to see? Maybe one. I haven't looked at the chronology, so I'm not sure if we're already past the last one, but I'm thinking none. So it's not going to matter anyway. But he's telling Peter, I am not under obligation to pay this tax. However, I'm going to anyway. Why? Okay. He says, not to give offense to them. Now, Jesus was not worried about offending the tax the men who were there to get it in the way that we normally think of that. He wasn't worried about making them mad or offending them about the fact that he didn't pay this tax. But he was worried about doing anything whatsoever that would give them fuel or ammunition to paint or cast his ministry in a negative light. And not paying the tax, they would not have been able to understand the principle that he didn't pay the tax, would they? You think those tax collectors would have understood, I'm the Son of the Father in heaven? And they would have said, oh, you're right. So that makes sense, because kings wouldn't want their sons to pay the tax. So, sorry we stopped by. No, not even close. Even if they believed or thought in their minds that he did do things like Nicodemus said, nobody can do the things that you do unless God's with him, and other people made statements like that. They still would have used that against Jesus, don't you think? Because like we said, that's probably the reason they were there in the first place. Now, Jesus, as he always did, is going to masterfully and perfectly do what should be done, the right thing. Not to offend them, not to give occasion for them to use this against me, which Peter probably understood, because that's probably one of the reasons why he answered so quickly, yes, he does pay. Even though he hasn't paid yet, he does pay the temple tax. And
I think he was picking his battles. Sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes more harm can come from being right than just giving in. Sometimes it's best to give in. And
it may be that
you have to pick your battles.
it may be that he didn't see this as something that would have had the outcome that was worthy of going through it all. Or maybe it was the timing. This is not the time for this to happen, to unfold. So he's just going to let this one go by. But he does does give a moral lesson here, some spiritual instruction, if you will. But if you think about it, what Jesus has done is very similar to what Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 9. If you remember, Paul, he specifically and intentionally refused to be supported by the church, but he did his secular job to support himself. Why did he do that? Because the Corinthians were poor and couldn't support him? Why did he say he did it? You remember? Okay, he didn't want to be a burden. And part of that was, I didn't want to do anything in addition to that, that would give, let me see exactly how he words it here, to put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. I didn't want to do anything that would put an obstacle there. And then later, further down, he says, my reward is that in my preaching, I may present the gospel free of charge so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So he says, I have a right for you to pay me. But I withheld that from myself so as to not put any obstacles in the way. So he says, I deprived myself of my God-given right for the sake of you and the gospel. So Jesus is doing a similar thing here. I have the right to not pay this tax as the Son of the Father, but I'm going to pay it. At least in this situation. And the way that he pays it is pretty impressive. He says, let me reach here in my pocket or under this couch cushion here. I think I felt something under there earlier. Happens to be the perfect amount. Nope, not even close. He says, go to the sea and cast a hook out there, and the first fish that takes a hold of that hook, open its mouth, and you're going to find a shekel in there. What's a fish doing eating a shekel? I don't know. Did he eat the shekel? Or did the shekel magically appear, miraculously appear when he got the fish? I don't know. What I do know is Jesus had a reason to do this. And I dare say it was not because this shows how poor he was and how poor the disciples were. They couldn't even afford the tax. So they had to get it miraculously out of the fish's mouth in the sea. I don't think there's any support for that idea. But I may not know why he did it, but I'm impressed. That's pretty impressive. It's unique as well. It's not a miracle. It's an unusual miracle, to say the least. For one thing, it's the only miracle in which Jesus himself, in any way whatsoever, benefited. And I would even, put an asterisk by that, because he could have paid this without doing that. But yet, he did technically sort of benefit from that, the result of that miracle. And so it's the only miracle where he benefited personally, even though he barely benefited. It's the only miracle that involved money, that's recorded at least. It's the only miracle of which we're not told the outcome. We don't get to hear the rest. We don't even get to read about Peter going to get the fish, going to the sea. We just understand that he did. And so Jesus did pay the temple tax. Now, very quickly, even though we've already touched on it a little bit, this idea, so as not to give offense to them. This concept, just like Paul, I am not willing to do anything that will create a stumbling block in terms of my cause and my ministry. Now, Jesus did several things that created a stumbling block for some of his opponents, because that wasn't very hard to do, was it? I mean, you could put anything out there and it was going to be a stumbling block to the people that wanted to attack Jesus. But as far as his cause and his ministry and his mission, he wasn't going to contribute to any obstacles in that way. And we shouldn't either, just like Paul. Even though he says God has said that those who live by the gospel or by preaching the gospel should make a living from the gospel, I'm not going to exercise that right, because I care more about you and the cause of Christ than that. So Paul, taking the example of Jesus in so many different ways, I am not going to appeal to my rights. I will forego them for the cause of Christ if need be. If you remember, the same apostle, 1 Corinthians 8 and Romans 14, said, I'm not going to do anything that'll make my brother stumble. So I have the right. I understand that eating meat that may have been involved in an idol temple somewhere, I buy it at the marketplace because even though it came from there and I eat it, doesn't mean anything because that meat can't be turned into anything else but meat. I mean, it's the same no matter where it came from. However, if by doing so I will in some way be causing my brother to stumble, I'm not going to ever touch meat again. So it's that same principle. I have the right and understanding, the knowledge that that meat is totally fine to eat, spiritually speaking, morally speaking, but not everybody has that understanding, and I don't want to cause my brother to stumble or sin in anything that I do, so I'm willing to forego what my rights, what I perceive to be my rights, or what I know to be my rights, if it's going to cause some sort of stumbling block or temptation for my brother. Jesus lived that same kind of thinking, always thinking about somebody else.
So being right isn't always the most important thing. Even though you're right in a situation, that doesn't mean it's the most important thing.
Yeah, it's not. Now, in some things it is, you know.
Sometimes it is. It's time to go to war, but sometimes you have to
Yeah.
And that shows he had great wisdom because he knew when to execute and when to be quiet.
Yeah, that's the challenge. That's the skill that he had perfectly, was always knowing which one to do. You know, when to be firm and when to back off. And again, if he was not the Son of God, then he would have paid the tax without question because he would have been obligated to do so. But since he wasn't obligated, that's where the choice, he could have made his case to these men. Don't you think Jesus wanted those men that were there to collect that tax, that he was the Son of God? Don't you think that he wanted them to know that and to believe that? So this was a prime opportunity for him to make that case. Listen, guys, I haven't paid it. I've been out of town, but I'm still not going to pay it now that I'm here, because in case you didn't know, I'm the Son of God. Remember, he had already said on one occasion, I am the bread that has come down from heaven and things like that, and a lot of people stumble over that. He could have made a strong case, this is why I'm not paying the tax. Whether you believe it or not, this is the truth. But instead, he said none of that. He just paid the tax. He paid it in a very strange way, admittedly, but he paid the tax, and that was the end of it. He denied himself to keep the peace, as was said, to not give offense. So, back to our starting question then. Is there ever a time when your personal rights are more important than doing what is right? No. My personal rights are never more important than doing whatever is right. Right is always more important than rights. And that's the power of 1 Corinthians 8 and Romans 14, is those verses are talking about matters of opinion and things that you have a right to do. There's nothing wrong with doing this thing, except that there could be something wrong with doing the thing that there's nothing wrong doing, depending on what might be the result of doing that thing. There are other circumstances to consider besides, do I have the right and liberty to do this? It may not be right, even if you have the right to do it. Even if it's not sinful. Something that's not sinful can become sinful, depending on the circumstances. Like I said, as Americans, we have a plethora of liberties and rights. But what we should ask is, will God be glorified in doing this? Because that should be our goal. Our primary job is to glorify God. 2 Corinthians 5, 9, and 10 says, so whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. So our aim in all things is to please God. If what I'm going to do is not going to please God, even if I have the right to do it, if by doing it I'm going to displease God because of a domino effect or some effect it has, byproduct or a side effect, then I shouldn't do it, even if I have the right. I should choose my brother, unity, the cause of Christ, God's glory over everything involving myself, my rights, my liberties.